And if by chance an honest man like yourself should make enemies, then he would become my enemies. And then they would fear you.
Be my friend? Godfather?
Vito Corleone in the Godfather saga is a fictional character. That's no secret. However, how many people know he was inspired by real mafia godfathers active in New York during the 1940s and 50s? Few, I imagine. Yet it is quite easy to draw parallels between Don Corleone and reality. Take a look. Don Vito's discreet lifestyle in the film designed to stay under the authorities' radar? That's a nod to the life of Godfather Carlo Gambino. Seeing him achieve a leadership position in the underworld at a young age and later instructing his son not to follow the same path, that brings to mind the story of Joseph Bonanno. The olive oil business to cover the family's illegal dealings? It's a reference to the importation business Joe Profaci opened in the 1920s. But what is even more striking is the connection that can be made with another Godfather. A Godfather whom actor Marlon Brando went so far as to imitate by adopting a voice and gestures almost identical. A Godfather who, like Don Corleone, had a strong relational influence through numerous political contacts. A Godfather who categorically refused to let his men get involved in drug trafficking, just like Don Vito. And who had a life relatively similar to the well-known fictional character. Frank Costello. His crimes and his businesses were far more calculated and brutal than the fictionalized versions described in movies like The Alto Knights. Today, you've probably guessed who we're talking about. We're talking about the Prime Minister of the Underworld, Frank Costello. The Prime Minister. Frank Costello earned that nickname because of his many political connections and his preference for peace over war within the underworld. Considered one of the most respected and influential mobsters in mafia history, he had a slew of politicians under his thumb, using them to benefit the entire New York underworld at the time. He alone represented the most powerful political force in New York in the 1940s and 50s. No one could become a judge, high-ranking official, or even mayor of the city without Frank's approval. His creed was always to avoid troubles. Frank avoided them like the plague, to be honest. So while other gangsters were killing each other in bloody turf wars, he calmly counted his stacks of bills in his luxurious office. In the 1940s, Frank Costello became the new godfather of the Luciano family after his friend Lucky was expelled from the United States. It was his ingenuity, determination, and developed business sense that propelled him to the highest echelons of the mafia. To achieve this dominant position, one can only imagine the events that transpired. That's why we're exploring the life of this historically overlooked figure. From small independent gangs in New York at the beginning of the 20th century, to the windfall that was prohibition in the 1920s, to his ascent in the Cosa Nostra with his associate Lucky Luciano, and through his rivalry with the uncompromising Vito Genovese, you will now know everything about the life of Frank Costello, the Godfather, the real one. From Calabria to East Harlem. It's a boy! The sixth child of the Castiglia family. For the parents Luigi and Maria, it was a rather unexpected event. They did not anticipate that January 26th, 1891 would be the day of their new child's birth. Nevertheless, it was good news, and now it was time for the baptism. In full force, the members of the Castiglia family headed to the church in their village, located in the Calabria region. Well wishes were met with a timid response from Luigi Castiglia. Their family was already very poor, and the arrival of a sixth child wasn't going to improve their situation. "What name do you want to give the child?" asked the parish priest. Francesco Castiglia. The life of the man who would later be called Frank Costello had just begun. Around 1893, the Castiglia family had split into two. Don Luigi decided to go to America in hopes of escaping the poverty of the Italian countryside. The meager resources at his disposal didn't allow him to take his entire family with him, so he was forced to leave his wife, two of his daughters, and his son Francesco in Calabria. Don Luigi was certain that he would earn more money in America and that the rest of his family would join him soon. For him, it was just a matter of time. However, the disappointment would be significant. Upon arriving in America, he struggled to save money. Life there turned out to be just as tough as in the Calabrian countryside. Sell everything, even the bed sheets if necessary, he told his wife. But come to America. So after 2 years had passed, the last tickets were purchased. The rest of the family could finally join the United States. In 1895, Francesco Castiglia set off for the New World. He would later recall this moment. It was just the three of us, my mother, my sister, and me. All we took with us from the old country was this huge iron pot my mother likes to cook in. They just fixed up the pot like a bed by lining it with a blanket, and that's where I slept for the entire crossing. The school of crime? In America, the Castiglia family settled into a precarious apartment in the Italian ghetto of East Harlem in New York. They didn't feel too out of place, as the lively neighborhood they lived in was predominantly composed of people from Calabria. Over there, everyone spoke Italian. To provide for his family, Luigi Castiglia opened a grocery store on 108th Street. However, the business brought in little income, just enough to cover housing and food. Despite the help from Maria and the children, the offspring, growing quickly, never had enough to satisfy their hunger. Life was tough. At dinner, Francesco never failed to compare the contents of his plate with those of his siblings to ensure he received his fair share. One of his friends would later recount that when you dined regularly with Frank, you quickly learned not to touch the contents of his plate. This phobia traced back to his impoverished childhood. At the age of 9, Francesco began attending school. It was during this period that his name first appeared in its English form. For young Frank, learning the language of Shakespeare was a challenge. In general, it seems that school was not his forte. He despised attending classes and preferred roaming the streets. At least outside, he could earn a bit of money. His older brother Eduardo taught him how to improve his lifestyle by stealing some fruits from the local merchants. This enabled Frank to gradually but steadily tread the path of delinquency. "Go to school, my son," his father would say. "I go to school, father. I go to school every day." "Francesco, I don't like the friends you have. They are no good and will amount to nothing." "I will amount to something, Mama. Something better than spending my life in a grocery store." Frank would loathe and disdain his father throughout his life. The reason was that he regarded him as too soft, too humble, and content with his lot. In fact, he simply couldn't comprehend why his father had accepted such a poor and mediocre life. Frank permanently left school at the age of 13. From now on, he seamlessly blended into the petty delinquency of his neighborhood. The school of crime is where Frank had chosen to educate himself. A school that, in the early 20th century, would shape some of the greatest gangsters in the history of the United States. Frank was about to become a part of it. Lessons from the street? In East Harlem, the neighborhood where Frank Costello lived, a Sicilian mob boss named Ignazio Lupo dominated the area in the early 1900s. Lupo, the Wolf, as he was nicknamed, had managed to gain control of the city by merging his organization with Giuseppe Morello's family. Originally, the mafia was a secret society created by Sicilians for Sicilians, eventually becoming a true state within a state. The catch is that once imported to the United States, the mafia bosses decided to forget what had been the very essence of their organization and began extorting their fellow Italians. Ignazio Lupo was one of these racketeers. His men would knock on the doors of merchants, demanding payment of a tax in exchange for protection. And if you were the merchant, you had better pay the tax, or they would beat you mercilessly. And if that wasn't enough, well, they would simply burn down your shop. But before they harmed you, the mafia generally warned you by sending a letter marked with a black hand, the emblem of their extortion method, a sinister seal that terrified all those unlucky enough to receive it. These extortion gangs, known as the Black Hand, were not as organized as the modern mafia that would emerge in the 1930s. However, there was one rule that everyone scrupulously respected: Omerta, the law of silence. Frank Costello, who continued his apprenticeship in the streets of East Harlem during this time, conscientiously adhered to it. He had clearly observed that in his neighborhood, informants were not well received. Spilling the beans at a police station equated to being scorned in the streets, and in worst cases, it simply meant signing one's death warrant. Frank had understood this well, so much so that he would not betray a single person in his life. Then one day, he was caught red-handed by a patrolling police officer. Suddenly, a city councilor, recognizing him, intervened. "I'll take care of that little rascal," he said. The officer, not bothering, left it to the politician to deal with Frank. "I've just done you a favor. Now remember that when I need a favor." Frank was stunned. Why had this man done him this favor by releasing him from the hands of the police? Finally, he grasped it. He had just understood the importance of doing favors for others. It was a bit like depositing money in the bank. You could withdraw from the account when you needed it, and the bigger it was, the more comfortable you were. It's a lesson he wouldn't fail to put into practice later, developing one of the biggest influence trafficking operations in the history of organized crime in America. The Four Horsemen. It's during this period that Frank Castiglia changed his name. Henceforth, he went by Frank Costello. Why Costello? The exact reason is not clear. Perhaps he changed it to prevent the police from tracing it back to his parents, or maybe it was better to integrate into society. Costello, surprisingly, is an Irish surname. There might be another reason. According to the memoirs of Charlie Lucania, better known as Lucky Luciano, an Italian immigrant who, like Frank, was making a name for himself on the streets of the East Side, the two became acquainted at a movie theater in Times Square. "It was a Saturday night," Lucky recalled. "We like to go to the movies because them silent pictures had titles and they helped us learn English." This particular night, the manager threw us out, and at the same time, he threw out some other guys. One of the guys was a little bit older than us, and he had an outfit called the 104th Street Gang. We got together, and it turned out that this older guy was not from Sicily. His name was Francesco Castiglia. Later on, though, he got famous under the name of Frank Costello. Frank Costello and Lucky Luciano would later become very good friends. Both young men aspired to the same ambitions in life. They were both insightful, resourceful, and willing to do whatever it took to carve out a place for themselves in the underworld. Later on, they would meet two other gangsters, two Jews also hailing from the East Side, Meyer Lansky, a small and cunning tough guy, and Benjamin Siegel, nicknamed Benny or Bugsy, a tall, handsome guy whose appearance could be deceiving because he had an itchy trigger finger. The four of them formed a gang, an association. Luciano finally recalls, "We was the best team that ever got put together. We knew our jobs better than any other guys on the street." According to Lucky, this is how Costello got his name. During their first heist together, Meyer Lansky objected to the Jews always taking the risks. Lucky responded, "What do you mean, two Italians? We are one Italian, one Irish, and two Jews." "Where's the Irish?" Meyer asked. Lucky pointed to Frank. "Him. He's Irish, you know, Frank Costello." That's how Costello got his name. Lucky remembered. When we got up to our ears in New York politics, it didn't hurt at all that we had an Italian guy with us with an Irish name. Behind bars. To play with fire is to eventually get burned, and Frank Costello was about to face the justice system. His first arrest occurred on April 25th, 1908. Frank, accompanied by two other young thugs, was arrested in the Bronx after beating up and robbing a coal merchant. In front of the judge, he pleaded not guilty and was granted a dismissal. For this first one, let's say he got lucky. Then there was another on October 16th, 1912, on 108th Street, this time for armed robbery. Frank, again with two acquaintances, stole nearly $3,600 in cash and $220 worth of jewelry from a housewife. On the day of judgment, he pleaded not guilty again and miraculously escaped with a dismissal. Perhaps he had threatened the plaintiff to drop the charges. No one knows. But then he committed one offense too many. The arrest took place in Manhattan on March 2nd, 1915, just a few months after Frank married a lovely brunette. By that time, Frank had made it a habit not to go out without his revolver. Unfortunately, on that day, he was arrested for carrying a concealed weapon. Initially, he told investigators his name was Frank Saverio, reference to his mother's maiden name, but eventually claimed his real name was Costello. Clearly an attempt to confuse the authorities and prevent them from discovering his true identity. However, Frank realized that this time, it wouldn't be as easy to get away with it. Pleading not guilty wouldn't result in a dismissal, and the bail for temporary release was too high. With no other option, he had to accept it. He would have to languish behind bars before his trial. As time passed, the weight of prison gradually took its toll on him. Well, it was decided he would plead guilty. "Saverio, what is your real name?" the judge asked. "Costello. I find that in 1908, that is 7 years ago, he was arrested for assault and robbery, and in that case, he was discharged. I find that in 1912, he was again arrested for assault and robbery, and he was discharged in that case. In those cases, he gave the name Frank Costello. In this case, he gives his name as Frank Saverio. I have looked him up, and I find his reputation is not good. On the contrary, it is bad. Will your honor give me another chance?" Frank pleaded. "You have had chances for the last 6 years, and those chances have to cease sometime." "Your honor, I took the plea just because I was in prison for 1 month and wanted to avoid trouble. I was a married man, but the revolver wasn't found on me. It was found 100 feet away from me." "That is right, and they saw you throw it there. The officers followed you and saw you throw the gun away, and they first captured you and then took you back and got the gun. In other words, your actions were those of a guilty man in every particular. I sentence you to the penitentiary for 1 year." Frank served 11 out of the 12 months, his good behavior earning him a reduction in sentence. Released in April 1916, he then returned to wandering the streets of East Harlem. While in prison, he had thought long and hard about his future. He was determined not to end up back behind bars. Running through the streets with a firearm and the prospect of going back to prison, or worse, losing his life, was not part of his plans. "That's when I realized I was stupid," he later said. "Carrying a gun was like carrying a label that said, 'I'm dangerous, I'm a criminal, get me off the street.' I made up my mind I would never pack a gun again. And I never did." The beautiful gift. Clearly, Costello needed a break away from petty crime. What he needed was serious business opportunities. At that moment, the most beautiful gift a small-time gangster like him could dream of arrived to change his criminal dimension. A major event that would soon transform his life and the lives of many other delinquents in the working-class neighborhoods of New York: Prohibition. January 16th, 1920. Midnight. The 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution, ratified a year earlier, comes into effect. It is now illegal to manufacture, transport, import, export, or sell alcoholic beverages. Prohibition had been inaugurated. That night, a new era was about to begin in America. An era of fantastic disorder where the law would be constantly flouted. Years of prohibition that would turn out to be lucrative for a number of gangsters seeking prosperity, like Frank Costello and his associates, determined to seize the great opportunity that lay before them. When Prohibition begins, Costello, Luciano, Lansky, and Siegel are determined to play a significant role in this new market. Ambitious? There's no doubt. In fact, what they lack at the moment is experience. The four are barely adults and know that it will be challenging to compete with the bigwigs of the Italian mob in New York. Among these bigwigs were Joe Masseria and Ciro Terranova, old school Sicilians with a deep distrust of all non-Italians, especially non-Sicilians. This perspective was completely opposed to the new generation of gangsters like Costello, Luciano, or Lansky, who saw racketeering as strictly a business affair, where origin was not a prerequisite for doing business. Collaboration instead of bloodshed. And anyway, there was no time to waste. Prohibition was here, and Americans were eager for their thirst to be quenched. Their entry into the clandestine alcohol market begins with Joe Adonis, a young man as ambitious as they are. One day, Adonis is in Little Italy enjoying an ice cream with Charlie Lucky Luciano when he makes him this proposition. "Charlie, I know we never done no business together, but I need 10 grand to make a whiskey buy down in Philly, and I'll cut you in for half." The day before, Adonis had met Waxy Gordon, a bootlegger from Philadelphia. Waxy had offered him a shipment of guaranteed authentic Scottish whiskey, but Adonis didn't have enough funds to seal the deal. That's why he turned to Lucky Luciano. Lucky recalls, "I put my arm around Adonis's shoulder and I told him to keep his money, that he just found himself a partner who put up all the dough. I called Costello, Lansky, and Siegel, and we got together an hour later. The four of us put up 35 grand in cash." The deal was sealed, the first of many business ventures. Luciano himself recounts the beginning of their involvement in the alcohol trade. The profits were far greater than could ever have been realized by crimes against innocent persons and their property, and the penalties were far less. Protection could be purchased at all levels. Ever since we was kids, we always knew that people could be bought. It was only a question of who did the buying and for how much. It was Frank Costello, a little bit later, who really opened the door to the whole business of buying influence and protection. He had the style and the class of a guy twice his age, and with that Irish-Italian name we hung on him, he was able to move into all circles. That's when we set up a private bank. Not a real bank, we called it our Buy Money Bank. It started with 5 grand, and the pot was turned over to Costello to use any way he saw fit. We greased the police and the politicians. It was all part of the overhead, just like any other business. So thanks to Frank Costello, the gang had an entire network of politicians and cops on their payroll throughout Manhattan. This meant they could trade booze in peace. Big Bill and the Prime Minister. In addition to his activities with Luciano, Lansky, and Siegel, Costello also partnered with one of the biggest alcohol traffickers during Prohibition, William Vincent Dwyer, an Irish gangster known as Big Bill. And he wasn't called that because of his imposing physique, but due to his hefty bank account and significant political influence. Dwyer and Costello joined forces in 1923. At that time, Dwyer, already well established in alcohol trafficking, reportedly received a proposition from Costello that guaranteed him complete protection against increasingly frequent raids. For a bootlegger, enduring such attacks meant losing a lot of money, so William Dwyer likely had no other choice but to accept Frank's proposal, risking major trouble otherwise. The Costello-Dwyer partnership became one of the most effective and lucrative in Prohibition history. Every year, they imported an average of $40 million worth of alcohol. They were the only bootleggers during Prohibition who never lost a single truck. As money flowed in more and more, Frank started to gradually change his criminal dimension. Prohibition made him wealthy, more than just a bit, allowing him to invest in other ventures like real estate. The uncompromising businessman he was, he watched every dollar invested. This success opened the doors to high society for him. In this world, Frank felt like a fish in water. He was friendly, naturally gained trust, and had the appearance of someone not remotely threatening. These qualities allowed him to mingle with whoever he pleased without arousing suspicion. Frank then used this apparent credibility to expand his influence and contacts among high-profile individuals. He got acquainted with politicians, judges, journalists, city councilors, and even movie stars. He corrupted all these people, and in return, they protected his and his associates' underworld businesses. Were you a Prohibition-era alcohol smuggler with a problem? Go see Frank Costello, and he'd solve it in a snap. The Atlantic City Conference, 1929, is a significant year in the history of the underworld. During May 13th to the 16th of that year, the first organized crime summit takes place. The idea for organizing this conference came from Johnny Torrio, the former head of the Chicago Mafia who was Al Capone's mentor. Torrio aimed to establish a national crime syndicate, a kind of confederation where all American criminal organizations would be united. He envisioned defining the United States into slices so that each criminal group would be allocated its fair share. Within this national crime syndicate, everyone would be welcome. Not only Italian-American mobsters, but also Jewish and Irish gangsters, as well as African-American criminals. This convention aimed to lay the foundations for a new, more modern mafia, a visionary project that captivates Costello, Luciano, and Lansky, who share Torrio's vision. They decide to help organize this conference. The location is chosen, Atlantic City. Frank Costello takes charge of the invitations. Thus, the New York delegation, the largest at the meeting, arrives in Atlantic City, including Johnny Torrio, Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Joe Adonis, Vito Genovese, and Dutch Schultz. Chicago is represented by Al Scarface Capone, Frank Nitti, and Jake Guzik. In short, the biggest names in the underworld are present. The conference lasts 4 days. During this time, the mobsters discuss how to organize their operations, divide territories, and resolve disputes peacefully. The goal is to avoid the kind of violence that brings unwanted attention from law enforcement. Frank Costello plays a key role in these discussions. His political connections and diplomatic skills make him an invaluable asset. The other bosses recognize that his approach of buying influence rather than shooting rivals is the smarter path forward. The Atlantic City Conference marks a turning point. From this moment on, the American Mafia becomes a more structured, business-oriented organization. Violence doesn't disappear, but it becomes a tool of last resort rather than the first option. Frank Costello emerges from Atlantic City with enhanced prestige. He is now recognized as one of the most powerful and sophisticated gangsters in America. His transformation from a street punk in East Harlem to the Prime Minister of the Underworld is nearly complete. The lessons he learned on those same streets would serve him well in the decades to come. The importance of favors, the value of political connections, the wisdom of avoiding violence when possible, these principles would guide him through the turbulent years ahead. As Prohibition ended in 1933, many bootleggers found themselves scrambling for new sources of income. But not Frank Costello. He had already diversified his operations, invested his profits wisely, and built a network of influence that would sustain him for years to come. The real Godfather was just getting started. The real Godfather was just getting started. And if you think his story blew your mind, we bet that our next video pulled up to the left corner would blow your mind as to who is the Godfather as of today and still haunts down the life of many Americans today.